So from my experience of living in Geneva for 3 years, taking people on walking tours of old Geneva, the old city, we looked particularly at the legacy of John Calvin, who was the famous reformer of Geneva, and from that, all the time we were trying to help people to make the connection between the past. It wasn't just Calvin we looked at Henry Dunant, who was the founder of the Red Cross, and between these two men in particular, what their influence was on the modern day city of Geneva. Anyway, from that I've been percolating on some of these ideas, and this opportunity to look at Geneva through this challenge, the problem of social welfare, I find is really interesting. So let me just share a little bit of what we found, and then we can talk about it. What is the problem with welfare, social welfare? There's lots of them. It's complex. I did a little introduction in the paper. This illustration from the States kind of reflects a little bit the question of the legitimacy of the welfare system. How do different people view it? It's very contentious. But there's a legitimacy question in terms of its long-term sustainability, and there's an affordability question. The original concept, I think, was for it to be an insurance-based system where you make contributions like an insurance premium, and should you need to draw on that, it is there, just like a private insurance system. But of course, how do you make it accessible for everyone? How do you start that kind of system up without a big chunk of capital to begin with? That was the challenge. So even in the early days of the British welfare state after the Second World War, that crisis was already there because there hadn't been a kind of a big chunk of capital to begin with. But the biggest issue, which I feel is the one that is not being adequately reckoned on, is the long-term affordability, particularly through unfunded pensions. And because of the lack of funding for a promise that's been made by the state to provide pensions for everyone to an aging population, and when all our national insurance, so-called national insurance contributions that are being paid today are being spent today, they're not being put aside, we have a huge unfunded liability. Now there's something called the Taxpayers Alliance, who have tried to do some calculations of what this actually means. And they, for the 2014-15 year, they showed that the official national debt, the public sector net debt, the official figures were around £1.5 billion, is only about 17% of the real national debt, which is absolutely extraordinary. They say the real national debt is more like about £8.6 billion in terms of these unfunded liabilities. So here's the equivalent of that. It's a little bit more because it's a gross debt, not a net one. The national income figures, they reduce it by the kind of assets that they've got. But if you look at the gross debt, it's about 20% of that. Then the orange one here is the unfunded public sector pensions. So that's just for public sector employees and their retirement pensions. But then this enormous, just over half of the liability is for unfunded state pensions going forward. So the promise to pay these pensions without actually there being any provision for it other than the income, which is taken in each year, which, for the since about 2000, every year the government has been borrowing a little bit more each year to pay. So there is no setting aside. Paul Mills calculated that if we are to be making provision for these liabilities in the future, the government ought to be running about a 4 or 5% budget surplus every year to set aside the money to pay for these liabilities. So that's our problem. The equivalent is something like £320,000 per household. How is this going to? How do you square this circle? There's three main policy options available. One is to raise the retirement age, which is happening bit by bit. I don't expect to retire till I'm about 70. we can deduct larger pension contributions from wages, or we can freeze pension payments, how much people can actually receive. But all these things are politically very difficult to pass with a particularly high proportion of older people who are voting. So the last resort, therefore, is rapid inflation, to allow or encourage rapid inflation as a kind of policy tool of last resort, which would reduce the real value of those pension obligations. So that is, just in a nutshell, the crisis which we face. And it's a long-term one which requires an intergenerational response. That's part of what we're going to look at. And of course, each 5-year government tends to kick the can down the track because it is too painful, in a sense, financially to take this seriously. So we just hope that it will go away. So in our paper we said this calls for a radical reimagining of social security and fresh thinking about how to deliver a compassionate, just and sustainable welfare system. So last year, being the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, we thought, what can we do to draw some inspiration, perhaps, from the reformers who helped to change the landscape of Europe. The reformers had the conviction that the gospel should lead to the transformation of the whole of life, and it led to a comprehensive spiritual and social vision. And when you read about how they approached it, they didn't see this dichotomy between the spiritual and the material. It was much more kind of blended together and holistic in its approach. So, as I said in my introduction, we'll look at Geneva as a case study. And here in the center, the park in the center of Geneva is a commemoration for the 400th anniversary of the Reformation, of the 4 kind of great reformers. That's William Farel on the left. He was the fiery evangelist who really brought the gospel to Geneva. John Calvin, after that, who taught the city and established the Reformation there. Then you got Theodore de Bèze, who took over from Calvin and established the University of Geneva. And then you got John Knox on the right, from Scotland, who, in a sense, brought the kind of Genevan Reformation into the English-speaking world via Scotland. Anyway, looking at the experience of Geneva in the 16th century, in terms of their welfare provision, there's just 2 things I want to pick out. One was the Hôpital Général, which was an institution they established. There were about 7 or 8 earlier ones that the Catholic Church ran for helping the poor in different ways. They consolidated all that and set up one place that was both a home for the city's destitute and a coordination centre for the distribution of welfare, food and other services. And this Hôpital Général, that's the building, I think that's about, is built 50 or so years. It's not the original one, but it's one that's about 400 years old. And it carried on operating until the 1860s, this Hôpital Général. So it ran for a good 300 years. It was overseen by procureurs, and they were, it was like a management team drawn from the elite of the city, but run and managed by hospitaliers. They were the people who actually ran the thing from day to day. And one of the unique things that Calvin did was to appoint both even though the procureurs were voted by the city, he made both those posts deacons in the church to go alongside. In fact, he created these deacon roles which hadn't been there or not to the same level before that in the church, recognizing that this ministry was as important as the work of teaching and preaching. So there was a tremendous sense of bringing these 2 things together. And then the second area which we look at in the paper is that of poverty prevention. So the first one was delivering welfare services, but the second was preventing poverty through particularly strengthening family life. And this vision was shared by both the church leaders and the city leaders. If you've read about the history of Geneva, you may have, in the Reformation, you may have heard of this consistoire, the consistory, which was kind of a group of elders from the church plus some members of the city council who sat together and they held people to account for their behaviour. Something completely unheard of in our modern individualistic society. But what they would do is if families were neglecting their responsibilities, particularly if parents were spending their whole time drinking and gambling and letting their kids sort of run riot on the streets, they'd be called to account for their behaviour and encouraged, rather than punishment being the emphasis, they tried to encourage reconciliation and people taking responsibility and help being given where needed. But they also, so they tried to correct and help people who were going in a wayward direction, but they also made sure that everyone had education and training. Professional training so that everyone had the chance of a job or employment, and universal primary education began in Geneva. It was the first place in the world where provision was made for everyone to go to school, rich or poor, boys and girls. And this is the building, this is the Collège Calvin. It still runs as a secondary school in Geneva, built in the 1550s, and was that great example of primary education, which of course we've all learned from since then. Then in the paper we bring out, in a sense, from this story of these two institutions and approaches, 5 key features of this Genevan welfare system. Firstly, that they took a long-term approach and a preventative approach. They really sought to ensure that, as far as possible, future demands on the public purse were minimised wherever possible. Secondly, they legitimised the link between personal behaviours and public welfare costs. And that, as I say, is one of the things I find the most interesting. And of course, people didn't like it. Subsequent historians look back and say, oh, that was terribly coercive and authoritarian. But at the time, I mean, it was not dissimilar to the culture of the Middle Ages anyway. But they wanted people to succeed. They wanted families to succeed particularly. And they encouraged, both the city and the church placed a high value on taking responsibility for oneself and one's families. But at the same time, the authorities were committed to providing for those who had genuinely fallen on hard times. So it wasn't you're all entirely responsible, sort your lives out, Daily Mail sort of style. It was also, that was complemented with a real sense of we will help out if there's a genuine case. But because it was on a small scale, more relational, Geneva was a city of 10,000 people, it was possible to know people's stories and know if people were in genuine need or if they were, in a sense, trying to play the system, as we would say it today. So that's another feature. The one-stop shop for welfare services, the consolidation of everything into this one institution of the Hôpital Général for both provision and education and prevention, meant that people could be dealt with holistically and families could be addressed, the kind of combination of their needs could be addressed in a holistic way. And since the causes of destitution are complex and interrelated, it meant that a more personalised and holistic response could be offered. The fourth feature was that the welfare system was overseen by some of the top business and political leaders in the city. That meant that those who made the policies would also see the consequences of their decisions and have first-hand acquaintance of the hardships and challenges facing the poor. So that prevented the poor from being somehow anonymous and distant. It closed that relational gap very much. And so policymakers really understood the wider moral and social context of the poor in Geneva. And lastly, a feature was this collaborative relationship between the civic authorities and the church. Now, some people think, oh, that was all right. Geneva was a theocracy. The church and the state were one. It wasn't actually true for all but the last few years of Calvin's life. I think the last sort of 7 or 8 years, he was at loggerheads with the city council over so many issues. He was very influential. the city as a whole had adopted the Reformation and said, yes, we will en masse follow the Reformation, become Protestants. But that was as much for political reasons as spiritual ones. But there was nonetheless a clear sense of common shared interests in how the city was going to deliver welfare. And so, on the whole, it was they found a mutually cooperative approach to take. So we go from there to say, well, how might we reimagine welfare today? And we wrote, while these case studies from Geneva will not offer any direct solutions to the problem of welfare provision in Britain, they provide some historical distance on our own situation, allowing us to take the long view and imagine how social welfare could become more effective and sustainable today, and the church play a significant role. So let's have a little bit of a discussion now, or if you want, have you just begun, as anything that we've looked at here or in the paper, have you started to reimagine anything as you've listened to this Geneva experience? Any thoughts at this point? Well, let me just give you an outline of some of the points we brought out, but I wanted to encourage, because this case study of Geneva is one which I think is very fruitful as we try and draw from the stories of the past, the history of how other people have solved some of these problems, okay, in a very different context, but what were the principles, and particularly, how were they being informed by a biblical perspective, a biblical worldview? So anyway, we talked about in the paper how the family is the key to the welfare equation, because healthy families are the main source of welfare provision. When we talk about welfare and the costs of welfare, well, that's only the welfare that is paid for, provision paid for by the state. The vast majority, 2/3 of all care for people who are old or sick or whatever, is provided within families, even today. So the vast majority of care is still family-based, and therefore healthy families are the main source of welfare provision. But on the other hand, broken families, they put a lot of the demands, not the only demands, but a lot of the demand factors on welfare. And the Relationships Foundation, our sister organisation, calculates each year the cost of family breakdown to the taxpayer. And it was 48 billion. I think they've just brought out their figures for this year, which are 50 billion, I believe it's reached. And these are all the knock-on costs of families breaking down. And yet, our welfare system on the whole, our social welfare, is based on an individualistic, largely family-blind view on individual rights, and you are individually able to draw on the provision of the state, and it's an individual right, and we fail really to take sufficient make a sufficient account of the family context. And politically, this is difficult to be acknowledged. You don't often see this acknowledged because of this fear of appearing to stigmatize single parents. Even though most of the time it is not a stigmatization, and single parenthood can happen for all sorts of reasons, and yet because of this fear of stigmatizing single parents, often the social good of marriage and families is just not adequately acknowledged or promoted. So these are a little bit of the context today. So what are some of the strategies to try and strengthen extended families? And there's just two points amongst others that we've made. Firstly, to provide relationships education courses. Most of the time when people talk about investing in relationships, it is in things like Relate and trying to deal with relationships in crisis to stop them breaking down, or a marriage breaking down, or a family breaking down, rather than investing in strengthening the preventative side. So RSE, relationships and sex education, it's just been turned around. Used to be sex and relationships, now they've said relationships and sex. There's pros and cons of that, and especially as the kind of curriculum, who's driving the curriculum. But definitely helping kids to understand how to build long-term friendships, long-term relationships, is a great opportunity. And where we talked about strategies here, it's particularly ones that the church can contribute to. So providing those schools, education, secondly, marriage preparation and enrichment, or couple preparation for families forming. There's lots can be done there. Parenting courses, again. There's we've in our community, we live in a housing estate, a new housing estate on the side of St Neots, and my wife's involved with leading a fresh expression of a church there, and we are providing almost every new initiative. The demand is tremendous. So right now we're just starting a parenting course, and it was just no effort at all to get people to come. An acknowledgement, oh gosh, yes, we need help with this, and we're glad to come along and learn together. The other point that we made was the whole question of co-location of relatives. It's something that it's easy to say, yes, this would be great, but very hard policy-wise to incentivize it. But one idea could be more new multiple dwelling homes. So the idea of a multiple dwelling home is one where it's possible for two sort of generations of the same family to be able to live under the same roof, but with a degree of independence. So basically that would mean 2 kitchens and perhaps 2 living rooms. They don't have to be huge, but just as most house builders have to, they're required by the council to build 20-30% of their houses as affordable housing. What about introducing the idea of a certain small percentage of the housing needs to be multiple dwelling? Because that then enables extended families to stay together. Another idea could be VAT exemption on the cost of adding a granny flat, like this little unit on the side of the house. And if you start to think intergenerationally about it, it's a great idea. For example, right now, where it's really hard for newly married couples to afford their own home, just because of the cost of housing. And for example, so if a house had a kind of a small granny flat, as it were, initially, that could be where the kids who wanted to get married, they could initially live. And then in a few years later, as their parents were older and the other kids were perhaps out, they could swap, and the young couple in the granny flat, as it were, as they start to have kids, they could then move into the big part of the house, and the parents could then move into the granny flat. This idea of how can you make a house work intergenerationally, recognizing that the size of the house you need goes from small when you're first starting out to larger when you've got more kids, and then to small again as your kids leave home. And other suggestions we made around tax incentives and some corporate policies there as well. And then the second main point that we made was to think about local churches as welfare advocates. And one of the crucial things here is that not think of welfare as only providing for people who are hard up, destitute, or in need. Because welfare, it should be much more than the idea of being against evil. Now, this language against evil, because the Beveridge, William Beveridge, when he launched the post-war welfare state, it was to address what were called the 5 evils at the time, which were want, idleness, ignorance, disease, and squalor. But instead, we should think of welfare as being for good. And the provision of welfare is helping people to flourish and live life in all its fullness. And of course, that is a wonderful biblical concept. So how can we invest in the welfare of our community? By building positive social assets, building social and relational capital. There's great opportunities for doing this. And when you look at some of the things which the churches are doing, there's a whole range of ways where, in some ways, yes, it's addressing a need, but it is in order to try and help people to manage their lives better, to grow in their responsibilities, to raise their families well, to get employment, develop their skills, get out of debt, all kinds of ways in which the church can be advocates for a better way of living. And so it's very important that where churches do get involved in welfare, we shouldn't do the same things necessarily that the state is doing in terms of providing materially for people. We should concentrate on doing the things which the state can't or won't do. Otherwise, there is a risk that the state will say, okay, we can afford to pull back the welfare state because we'll let the church do this part. In Manchester, about some of the things that the churches, local churches around Manchester were doing, the councillor said, this is all very impressive and laudable, but it's not strategic or coordinated. And Roger Sutton, a pastor out there, he thought, no, this is a real challenge for us as the church. We are doing a whole load of different things, different churches, different congregations, a tremendous degree of involvement. But the city authorities are not really recognising that because we're not coordinated, we don't speak with one voice. And where that has started to happen, it's led to a much more significant partnership, which is one of the inspiring things from Geneva, this partnership between the city authorities and the church. And the Cinnamon Network has been doing a lot to try and encourage this. They did these faith action audits 2 or 3 years ago to try and map all the different social initiatives that churches are taking across the city and then aggregating them. And I should have brought it on my desk, is the one from Cambridge, just showing all the different initiatives that are taking place within Cambridge. And of course it is impressive. And the overall figure there was that across Britain they estimated that the church or Christian organisations are providing £3 billion worth of services for free across the country. I mean, that's phenomenal. And lastly, we talked about shifting our focus from dealing with individuals to households. Let me just quickly read a paragraph from the conclusion, and then we've got a few more minutes to have a conversation. We finished by saying we began this paper by looking at the challenge of who will pay for social welfare when the state can no longer afford to. And we've ended up with the question of what the goal of the welfare system should be. The example of Geneva illustrates how prevention and provision can be integrally connected, and that the end goal should be to restore individuals and extended families to self-reliance. But in doing so, it's not only the recipients whose lives are transformed when welfare is grounded in a biblical vision. The ones who give are transformed also. Reimagining social welfare over the next few years is not only vital in order to limit the number of people facing poverty and deprivation. Mobilising the church to serve the poor can re-energise our mission too. So I think this is a great topic for us to engage with, and we have a few minutes left for a discussion or any further comments or questions. So thank you.